Welcome to Who Are You, the Bobcats Who Know the Stories You Don't. I'm your host, Joel Vanner, inside the podcast studio at Quinnipiac University School of Communications. And I'm joined today by my guest, David DesRoches. David, welcome to the show.
Hey, Joel, thanks for having me on. A little weird being in the guest seat over here. Used to being on your side, but happy to be here.
I know, we're in your house, and we'll get to that part in a minute. But we're in your house today. Thanks for having us for this program.
Thanks for having me on.
And I'm sure maybe you could guess, since you're a podcast pro, what my first question to you would be. And that is, who are you?
Wow, the $1 million question. I think, who am I? If you ask my wife, she would say, well, it depends on the day of the week and what mood he's in. But I think in broad strokes, I would say that first and foremost, I'm a husband, dog father, brother, uncle. And aside of my personal life, I have a real deep passion for building community and journalism, journalistic accountability, holding people and powerful to account. And that all manifests itself through the work I do as a journalism professor, but also, it sounds very serious, I know, being the podcast director here at Quinnipiac, podcasting isn't necessarily known as a medium for very serious work, but it is a medium where serious work can be done. And it's also a medium in which a lot of fun, silly things can be done and everything in between. So I find myself vacillating between the very serious work that I do as a journalist and as a teacher of journalism, but also having fun in the podcast studio, telling stories that are interesting, intriguing, engaging, building, like I said, building community, bringing people together, and doing that in a way that makes people feel connected to each other, included, and also engaged. But also, again, making sure that even though we're having heavy conversations or talking about things that might be a little complicated or challenging, that there is an element of fun and humor and playfulness in there, because I feel like sometimes we can take ourselves a little too seriously. So that's a big part of how I define me.
I agree with all of that. I think podcasting, it's really taken off recently as a very powerful storytelling medium. I enjoy it. I enjoy hosting it. But let's go back to David as a child. Maybe you didn't know podcasting was around then. Tell me about you as a kid. Where'd you grow up?
Well, I'm only 14, so podcasting was around when I was a kid. Grew up in...
You must be born on a leap day, right? Leap year?
Exactly. You got it. So I'm actually 98 years old. So I grew up in Virginia in a small town called Goochland County, Virginia, and we got our first stoplight when I was like 16 years old. And so, we had like 3 TV stations that we could watch and, spent a lot of time outside, hunting, fishing, just enjoying the outdoors, camping with my family. And I have an uncle, so my mom is one of 5. I'm also one of 5, and her brother suffered a head injury like the year before my brother was born. My brother's 2 years older than I am. And so through his injury, I, at an early age, understood what it was like for people to have a disability. And so I was always interacting with him. And he always seemed he always seemed lovely to me. I mean, I was a kid. I didn't know any better. But as I got older, I could see how the injury had manifested. So I was always aware that, people were different and that disability was a thing that it happens to everybody or could happen to anybody at any time. And so I think when I was around 8 years old, my grandparents, let me back up a little bit. So my grandparents, my uncle's parents, they started the Head Injury Foundation of Virginia in response to his injury. And so I was kind of around that when I was younger. And then at some point, I was 7 or 8 years old, I wrote this piece that was published in their local newspaper. And it was about the importance of balloon bags, which are airbags, but I didn't know that. I was
balloon bags.
Balloon bags. So it sounded a little bit cooler to me than airbags. And so I had this piece published, and probably a little bit of nepotism going on there. Grandma published it. I'll take it. But I think it kind of like instilled in me the value of information, and even though I didn't know it at the time, and also I found this kind of recently, this article I'd written, I don't know, somewhere in elementary school, where I was had written like a fake newspaper, had like written it out with the stories and the headlines and stuff. So. I didn't know it at the time, but I was kind of setting myself up for this lifelong appreciation of journalism and curiosity. And I think as I got older, learned more about the world, I actually really didn't want to go into media. Because I started to see the people who create the world that or they create the impression of the world that most of us understand it through. In other words, they are the lens through which so many people experience the world, media, right? Because not everybody can travel And so we understand the world through their lens traditionally, right? It's changed a little bit through social media, but that's sort of the traditional way that media has shaped our worldviews. And I really had found problems with that. I really found that it was not an accurate representation of the world, of people. I didn't think it was fair. I thought it was very much just pushing people into corners. And so I was very much against getting into media or journalism, even though I appreciated writing and appreciated communication. And so as time went on, I went to college, bounced around with things. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I was like a political science major. I was a music major, English. I jumped around all different. And then finally, I was like, at some point, I met somebody. I met a friend of mine, also a Joel, and I just really loved his vibe. He was just the kind of person that I wanted to spend time with. You know, you meet friends, and you're like, oh,
sure,
that's the good
college
energy.
is the place to meet them and explore new things.
100%. And so he was majoring in communication. So I'm like, I'll do that. He's cool. You know, because I was still, trying to figure out what I was going to do. And I think a lot of people in college, who am I? So when you asked me originally, who are you? I'm still trying to figure it out, Joel.
Right.
But this was part of that journey, was meeting him. And I was like, I liked his vibe, did communication. And then over, but I still didn't really want to get into media, right? That wasn't really the thing that I wanted to do.
You still had that distaste?
Yeah. It's still like, even though I was studying, and the more I studied it, then you start getting into communication theory, you start learning about different ways that people communicate through, symbiotics, nonverbal communication. So you start getting into the philosophy of communication. And that made me even more like unlikely to pursue that career, because I saw I saw media as being even more problematic as I learned a little bit more about, the academic side of it. But then fast forward a little bit, I didn't really do much in media. I worked at different jobs, and then at some point, I really wanted to do something with my life. And so a friend of mine who's a photographer, she had traveled to Egypt and Ethiopia and really fell in love with both countries. And I at the time was working in construction for my stepfather, and I was trying to do something. I always had this drive to help people, and I think it was rooted in, growing up around an uncle with a disability. So I always felt like, I saw my parents doing that. I saw my grandparents doing that. So it was kind of like built into me that you live a life of meaning by helping other people. But I couldn't figure out what that meant, what that looked like. And so I had dabbled in all these different kinds of things, and I couldn't really figure that out. But this opportunity to go to Ethiopia really resonated with me. And so we went there, and I moved there probably completely unprepared, totally completely unprepared. Like, I had no place to live. I had like maybe a couple $100 in my pocket.
Figuring it out as you go.
Oh my God. It was probably one of the dumbest things I've ever done, but ultimately turned out to be an incredible experience. It forced me to be uncomfortable in a way I've never been uncomfortable. And I feel like that's what travel can offer people. When you have to accept the discomfort and use that discomfort, not as a thing to shy away from or recoil from, but lean into, because I think that's where we discover our true selves, our true natures. And when we are faced with uncomfortable things, and we can, again, not just deal with it, but really like embrace it. Uncertainty, discomfort, these things that we tend to recoil from, because we live in this world in which certainty is ubiquitous. Like, I can just look something up on my phone. Bam, I have the information. I have it.
You can ask AI, find out anything you want to know. What brought you to Ethiopia that you wanted to know or understand?
So I had grown up in the 80s, and when in the 80s there was a famine in Ethiopia, and so my whole perception of it was it's this poor country and everybody's hungry. So that was all I knew about it. And
what the media portrayed to you.
Exactly. The media image was this, it was a starving country and they needed our help. Our parents would say when we're eating dinner, finish your food, there's starving children in Africa. That was the line. I mean, if you grew up in the 80s, that's what we heard. So that was my understanding. But as I started learning, oh my God, they have this incredibly wealthy culture. It's the second oldest Christian nation in the world. It was a kingdom. It was an empire at one point. The Abyssinian Empire spanned 2 continents. So it had this really, really profound history. And Muslims and Christians had lived there in peace for hundreds of years. They have rock-hewn churches carved out of the granite mountain that they're like still don't understand how they did them. They have the largest
sight to see. Yeah,
it's insane. The number of things that were there from a cultural perspective was just fascinating. It just kind of blew my mind, and it made me angry that I didn't know that. It made me angry that my perception was rooted in this media image that they've been feeding to me. And I was really kind of upset. So I was like, what else, right? What other things have I been wrong about in my understanding? And so this started this long journey of perception. And so even in all the classes I teach, perception is one of the biggest things I do. I have all these exercises where we talk about perception and how potent it is. And so that thing, learning that there was this incredible history, really pushed me to want to go there. And there's we could have a whole conversation about, white saviorism and inappropriate, things that a lot of Westerners do in African countries. And certainly in reflection, I realized that there was a lot of that. There was a lot of of that energy in when I was there. But for me personally, at the time, it was incredibly powerful for me to be able to see things in a different way, to be uncomfortable and to grow and to really value not just other cultures, but the importance of just authenticity, of being uncomfortable, of building community in strange places. And that is, I think, is a value that I've carried with me.
So that experience in Ethiopia, you talked earlier about the lens that you consumed media as you were growing up. You brought your lens to the stories that were happening there in Ethiopia. How did you come here at Quinnipiac and become our director of community programming with a focus on podcasting?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, the Ethiopia experience, because what we were doing there, we were telling people stories, traveling around, telling people stories. So I was meeting people, writing about them, publishing newsletters. So I was kind of doing feature writing. And then at some point, I had this point in my career where I was freelancing at a newspaper. So fast forward a little bit, after we left Ethiopia, I had to leave because I got married and I needed to get a job because I wasn't making too much money in Ethiopia. So I moved back to the United States and I got a job freelancing at a newspaper, and I was also working in the kitchen. So another passion of mine is cooking. And there was at one point when the guy who owned the restaurant was like, hey, I want to, he was only open for lunch and breakfast at the time. He's like, I want to open for dinner. You help me develop a dinner menu. I was like, oh, that sounds incredible. And literally this 2 days later, the newspaper offered me a full-time job. I had been freelancing with them.
Two doors open there. Which one do you go in?
Right. And I liked both of them a lot. Even though, to be honest, I really wanted the cooking thing because it was more creative. And again, the media thing, I was good at it, but But then I was having a conversation with a friend's wife, and she was like, dude, you're married. You need a full-time job. What are you talking about? And she was right. She was 100% right. And it's weird that a conversation with one person really changed the trajectory of my life. I might be still working in a kitchen somewhere if she hadn't have just been so real with me. And I think she was 100% correct. And that job, I got the journalism bug, and that was in Virginia. And then I started working in Connecticut, moved to Connecticut for another job in 2011. And then I started work at newspapers at some point. And then I was at the NPR member station in Hartford starting in 2015 as their education reporter. And that's when I got a taste for audio journalism and audio storytelling. So I've always been a musician. I've always been somebody who works with audio just as a hobby. So I knew those techniques. So now I was incorporating my passion for music and audio production with storytelling and journalism. And so those two things really hit me because I'd never imagined a world in which I could combine. Music was a hobby. I've been doing it for so long. I never thought I'd really do it professionally, but here I was using some of these techniques and doing journalism. So that really, really appealed to me. And then so I was there for a couple of years, and then Quinnipiac in 2019 posted this position, and I saw it and I was like, what? This is really forward thinking. So, at now, every university is podcasting, but at the time, universities were podcasting certainly, but they were not thinking about it programmatically. They were just somebody who, in the communications school would then sort of manage the podcast. But literally Quinnipiac's hey, let's have somebody just focus on podcasting. And I thought that was really forward thinking. And so I applied, and here I am.
And we're in the podcast studio in the School of Communications. Tell us a little bit about this space, who can use it, and the types of programming that students can use the space and produce their own programming, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So we do have two podcast studios at Quinnipiac, the one we're in now and in the School of Communications, and we have one in the Dome as well. They're both equipped with cameras and microphones, so you can do video or audio only if you want. And yeah, students podcast about all kinds of things. We have students podcasting about what it's like to be an underrepresented student in medical school. We have a special education podcast. We have sports podcasts. We have the podcast that I do weekly called Frenemies of the People. And we also have the podcast that I'm really, really excited about, Dismantling the Divide, which is a podcast about the global peace movement. It's about how we can come together and talk across division. Honestly, I feel like we need something like this now more than ever. So I'm really, really proud of that one. So students can come as they book the studio. They come in and they can do their podcast. I mean, I don't have any sort of content moderation. I mean, obviously, if you're defaming and slandering people, then we'll have a problem. But students come in, and I think the whole point is have fun, right? Podcasts should not be this thing that you kind of dread doing. It should be a thing that you come in and have fun, because if you're having fun, the audience will hear that fun and they'll come along for the ride with you.
They'll resonate with it. We talk a lot on the show about college being a place where students can try new things and explore new trends, maybe a media trend, podcasting. What do you think draws listeners to a podcast? What do you think students should keep in mind if they're interested in going into podcasting as they're thinking about ones that they want to create?
I think authenticity is everything. I tell students this all the time. Look, I know to a point, they're still trying to discover. A lot of students are trying to discover their authenticity. Who are they really in their core? And I think how you do that is you surround yourself with people who make you comfortable, and then the true you can emerge. And if the true you is emerging in the podcast, people vibe with that. People can sense BS, right? If you're like putting on a show or you're pretending to be a certain thing, unless you're an incredible actor, right? Most of us are going to be like, I don't get it. So I think number one is authenticity, like being yourself. If you're quirky, be quirky. If you're weird, be weird. If you're funny, funny, right? Smart or whatever, be you, right? And your whole self. And I think what makes podcasts different and appealing is that it's not perfect. And part of the appeal is its imperfection, is its humanity. When you watch CNN or MSNBC or Fox News, those are professional communicators. They're not talking with ums. They're very clear. But you watch somebody like Joe Rogan, who has like 20 million followers on YouTube. He was I don't know about that. It's like, and it might be annoying to some people, but other people are like, he's a person. That's how
more casual conversational tone. Yeah.
Exactly. It's conversational. It's casual. And I think when people watch them or listen to them, and you hear that sort of the thinking out loud or the hemming and hawing, which is natural human conversation, that connects us to them in a very personal human way that you don't get in traditional broadcasts. And I think that's really appealing to audiences, but also appealing to potential podcasters, because now they say, hey, they're just regular people having this conversation. I'm a regular person. I like to have conversations. I can do this.
You said earlier the Dismantling the Divide podcast is something you are leading. You're really excited about that. Tell us more about that podcast.
Yeah, I am really, really excited about it. So it started with the trip to the Nobel Laureate Summit in Monterrey, Mexico last year. So I was able to go with the Albert Schweitzer Institute, along with, it's about like 20 or 30 other students and faculty and staff from Quinnipiac. It was really, really great. They had Nobel laureates from around the world. Students from 70 different countries were there. And so I brought my recording equipment, recorded all these great conversations with students, international students, Quinnipiac students, researchers, academics, business people, Nobel laureates. It was just really, really special. And I was like, I didn't really have a plan for what I was going to do with it. I knew I was going to create something, but I didn't really know what. And through all the interviews that I had, I kind of realized, okay, the running themes are peace, obviously, art and music is another theme, narratives, stories, war, and power. Justice. So power is a running theme. So it's the power of each of those, the power of peace, the power of art, the power of narratives, the woes of war. I didn't want to say the power of war because I didn't want to promote it. And then the power of justice. So those were the themes that we approached. And we've got all these great interviews. We've got archival tape. We've got original music that I've composed for the podcast. I think it's just, I'm really, really proud of it. I've never done something like this. It's, I think it's an important, from my perspective, it won't sound all self-serving, but I think it's probably one of the best things I've ever done. And, I've been around the block a few times, so I'm really proud of it.
You mentioned you interviewed students as part of this podcast, and you traveled to the summit with students as well. What did you take away from your experience interacting with students in that environment?
Students never cease to amaze me. As frustrated as I get sometimes with the, technology problem that we all kind of have to deal with nowadays, at the same time, they consistently blow me away with their curiosity, their intellect. There's a moment when this man, he was a Palestinian man, he had lost 50 family members to the violence in his country. and he's a doctor. He lives in Canada now. And he was on stage, he was being presented on stage, and on the screen behind him, this is at the Nobel Summit, at the screen behind him, it had the flag of Israel underneath his name. And, it was this moment where somebody noticed it and he had to address it, and it was embarrassing. And like the rumors were spreading that somebody did it on purpose to hurt him and all these kinds of things. And the students were like up in arms about it. They were like, how could this have happened? And in those discussions, I understood it, it was bad. I was like, this is bad. This is a stupid mistake, but they were like, and in their sort of dissection of what it was wrong. So their understanding of justice is so much more visceral for them. Because I think the older we get, the more likely we are to accept the world as being crappy, But there's still in young people, there is still this really deep visceral sense of what is right and what is just that you have not been sort of numb to the world yet.
Right.
And for me, that's like inspiring. And so not only were they like really offended on this person's behalf, but they actually went into detail on why. And it wasn't just because of this. It was like there's all these other layers going on here.
And I think we need to foster that in students, right? Foster that mindset that you can change things. Things don't have to be the way they were just because that's the way they are, as some older adults may think. We need to kind of capitalize on that too and encourage students to keep thinking in that way and empower them through methods like podcasting and storytelling to tell those stories and perspectives.
Yeah, and I think the perspective piece of it is really valuable. And, Sean Duffy and I talked about this in the podcast. So Sean runs the Albert Schweitzer Institute. How when we travel, with students who maybe have never traveled internationally, and there are moments when they feel uncomfortable, like they're at a restaurant and they don't understand what's on the menu.
Sure.
And they just like, I just want to have a cheeseburger. And they kind of freeze up. But I think those are like moments where if we can engage them in that moment and help them, and I remember this happened to me a few times when I was traveling when I was younger, but engage them in that moment to take a moment of uncertainty and not recoil in fear, but embrace it. And it's a trick because sometimes our personalities are like that. No matter where we are, we just want what we want.
Right.
So it is kind of tricky, but the cultural influence is powerful. But seeing them kind of realize that, okay, this weird, uncomfortable, uncertain moment, if I can just get out of this fear, which is rooted in, not knowing, and just sort of accept something, just order the thing. And then suddenly they eat it and they're like, this is really great. I mean, that's like, for me, that's what we need as a planet, right? We need to be able to cut out the things that prevent us from understanding another person's point of view, because for so long, and this is how we all grow up thinking a certain way about the world. And until we consciously say, oh, there's another viewpoint of the world that's different from mine, not bad or wrong, it's just different, and that's okay. If we never consciously make that decision, we'll always be stuck in this place. So I feel like a big part of the motivation for this podcast was this idea of perspective, of encouraging people to want to open up. Because that's the first step. You have to want to consciously see how this other person thinks or why they think the way they think. And I think that the food example is a small, example of that with students, right? Like if they can just get out of that moment, that's the beginning of them being open. For any other moment that they have this uncertainty, like in any other context, they can apply that same thinking. Okay, I'm afraid, everything's uncertain and strange. Let me do what I did in the restaurant. Let me just open up to this uncertainty. Let me embrace it. And then it's freedom. You don't have to, then you're not stuck in this closed-minded way of viewing the world, which we all lose from that. The world is the diversity of the world is so incredibly beautiful. But we have to be open to seeing it. And if we don't, that's where we are today, I feel like. Where so many of us are just stuck and just unable to, they're crazy, they're, nuts. We did never take the time to just, why do they think the way they think? And how can I just reach out?
There is an art to being human, and I think there's an art to balancing your lived experiences and making sure they define who you are, right? But not prohibit who you could be or what you could do, which it sounds like that's exactly what you're describing.
100%. And I think we craft identities. Like that's, I jokingly said, that's $1 million question when you ask who I am, but I am a curated version of me, right? In this moment.
And you are more than you say in that response as well,
right?
Because you choose what you are
exactly.
in those contexts.
Exactly. Am I going to tell you all the deep, dark secrets about that really define who I am? Or even like not the deep, dark secrets, just like all the aspects of me that, I only share with the very close people, right?
Should be more
the
like,
real core.
Who are you today?
Who are you
right now?
That's where I kind of beat around the bush with the answer, right? Is because there's some truth to that. But at the same time, to your point, right? The experiences that we have that craft who we are, and how you don't want anything to take away from that, right? At the same time, the more connected our identity is to experience, the more disconnected our identity is to everything else, because we're so focused on the things that have happened to us. Because we're egotistical creatures. I mean, we are very self-centered. As much as we are communal, as much as we need each other, especially in this culture, right? We're very much me. So it's an individualistic. I can't even talk. Culture, right? It's like So there's that. There's the push, and there's the experiential push. But we can't let the experiences turn us away from, there are other kinds of experiences people have experienced that make them think differently. And just being, right, embracing and recognizing your truth and your experiences, but not, just like you said, not allowing that to turn you away from other people's experience.
Well, congratulations on launching the podcast.
Thank you.
Where can our listeners find the episodes?
So the podcast is Dismantling the Divide, and you can find it on Apple, Spotify, and on YouTube at the Quinnipiac Podcast Studios YouTube channel. Also, you can read the transcripts and listen at quinnipiacpodcasts.com/dismantling the divide. And if you want, you can also go to qu.edu/podcast. You can check out all the other podcasts that we do here at the podcast studio.
Well, thanks, Dave, for joining me on the program and sharing your perspectives and the work you're doing here at Quinnipiac and letting us use your house here at the podcast studio.
Well, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
If you like today's episode, you can find more on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube podcasts. And don't forget to subscribe and share. Until next time, when I ask my next guest, who are you? I'm Joel Vanner. Bye for now.